Nigeria's monetary crisis held the country in a standstill, with the nation's financial regulator and Apex Bank withdrawing old notes for new notes. The decision came days before arguably the most important election in Nigeria's modern democratic history, and it has increased the issues surrounding Saturday's presidential and National Assembly elections. Nigeria's seventh since 1999, the 2023 general elections carry the hope of different generations as it draws up a mixture of political gladiators. In the middle of these elections are the monetary problems that have frustrated Nigerians in the past weeks. The recent challenges in the country are expected to impact the elections, especially as Nigeria has battled various grades of economic tussles throughout the President Muhammadu Buhari administration. Bola Ahmed Tinubu, Atiku Abubakar, Rabiu Musa Kwankwaso, Peter Obi, four experienced Nigerian politicians, three former state governors, and a former vice president are all in the mix to rewrite Nigeria's economic story. But there's a log to remove in the country's recent monetary issues, and that may make the difference. Joining me to unpack all of this, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Pat Utomi, Professor of Political Economy. A warm welcome to you, Professor Utomi, and thanks for joining us on PHQ.
Pleasure.
Now, Professor, voters in Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy and most populous nation, head to the polls this Saturday to elect a new president and lawmakers amidst growing frustration over unprecedented insecurity, industrial scale oil theft, and surging inflation. What's your assessment of our state of democracy in Nigeria?
Well, I think it is fair to place this assessment within the context of data, real, hard information out there measuring our feeling about democracy. About 1998, as the 1999 elections were coming, a group of American academics, majorly at that time out of Michigan State, working with several African academics, set up what has come to be well known as the Afro Barometer. Those measures look at our attitude towards democracy. If you look at the reading in 1999, Nigerians were so excited, so desirous of democracy. You know, the Afro-Barometer readings were literally going through the roof. After nearly 2 decades of the practice of democracy, few people cared seriously about the democratic process in Nigeria from the readings of the same, longitudinal data of the Afro-Barometer. People were despondent, they were fed up, they didn't think democracy works for them. They thought it was a ruse, an excuse for coups by other means, literally speaking. And so voter apathy, was increasing, participation in elections getting low. And then suddenly last year, there was an explosion in the interest of Nigerians in democracy. And somebody must ask the question, what happened? Well, too many things happened. First of all, Nigeria has been so poorly run for so long that even those who didn't care at all about how the country was run became aware of the fact that something was wrong with how the country was run. And that the kinds of people who ran the country needed to give way to new kinds of leaders. The beginning of expression of frustration came from young people by right. That the majority by far, the median age in Nigeria is 18.1 or 2 years. So majority of this country's population is very young. That population has been shut out from input into how their country is run by a small group of gerontocrats. And they wanted to express themselves about things like how police harass them on the road every day, when they saw a laptop on them or they saw them looking prosperous. The NSAS protests was how they came to that And they were met with a force that was so brutal that many of them said, okay, we'll come at you through democracy. This is partly how the fire got started. Fire also got started because there was a convergence of many things. Convergence of a movement that, if you will, I had been central to for a decade or two, the so-called third force. The idea that the PDP or APC were incapable of giving Nigeria good government. I've said this not out of spite because I was there when both parties were founded, but the nature of the transactions that determined their politics just said to me, there's no way you can get progress running a country like that. You trade off. You help me carry ballot box, I make you governor, I make you minister. Doesn't matter whether you're competent at all to run that. In fact, I have a personal example of a fellow who had literally no education, not school set even, calling me up after General Buhari won the election and said, you know, we've been your supporters. I need to be made an essay to the president.
Wow.
I paused for a second. I thought he was joking. I said, essay to the president to do what? He said, anybody can do anything. What are you talking about? But that's how the Nigerian political class had brought down governance. Anybody can do anything. Now, if he was off,
yes,
way off in 85, it got much worse because of the appointments of General Buhari. And so Nigerians had gotten so fed up that they wanted to test the electoral process. This is how these elections came to become so important, so existential to the Nigerian people.
Now, Professor Utomi, you did mention the Afrobarometer readings, and from last year, we've witnessed an uptick in interest in our democratic experience, especially coming from that demography, young Nigerians. And also, some analysts have described the introduction of the bimodal voter accreditation system, BVAS, to identify voters through fingerprints, facial recognition, as a game changer, hoping that this will curb rigging and improve the integrity of our electoral process. Prof, what's your take on the introduction of BVAS and INEC's overall preparedness for these elections?
Well, I think that that's true to say that for many people, the introduction of BVAS raised hope that the democratic process would be less farcical than had been the case. It is the truth that every election that's taken place in Nigeria since 1999 has been not exactly a reflection of what the voters wanted, because politicians have invested more in how to thwart the outcome of the elections away from what voters intend than in educating people about their points of view, how they can run government. So there was a kind of general state of despair regarding the elections and the elections process in Nigeria. I participated as a presidential candidate twice in this process, and I recall very clearly sitting with foreign observers, very senior ones, Madeleine Albright, the now late former U.S. Secretary of State, former Canadian Prime Minister, and we're talking about the elections of 2007, and they were in shock that people could consider those elections. So when out of a series of, if you want to call it hand of God activities, electoral reforms came in through the Electoral Act that made BVAS a central issue, more people began to think maybe elections, that politicians can't interfere too much in trying to misconfigure. Maybe they are coming. This also increased interest in the electoral process, surely. So yes, BVAS is perceived by many as a game changer. It would be good to prove that what happened with the so-called overvoting in Oyo, which anybody who knows the system says is nonsense. There can't be overvoting with BVAS. But, you know, a judicial process is another matter altogether. So, anyhow,
okay,
we look to see how the BVAS thing, concretizes how people feel about it.
Yes. Now, it's a few days to the general elections, and Nigeria is facing its worst currency scarcity in history. The Supreme Court is going to make another announcement with regards to the introduction of the new Naira notes on the 22nd of February. Now, Prof, will this make any difference, whatever the Supreme Court has to say? And what do you make of the CBN's Naira swap policy? Are there political undertones to it?
I don't know enough to ascribe motives. There are all kinds of speculations out there. Now, when countries get to a certain state and their currencies are subject to significant abuse, or managing money supply becomes significantly challenged because of the nature of its position of holding cash, they do very surgical kinds of things. India has done so under Modi. The uproar was just as bad as we have seen in Nigeria, and it seemed to work some for them. I do not know exactly what the motives of the people in public office, in the central bank and the presidency are. All I can say is that perhaps it could be managed a little differently, but there are many who think that it will reduce the abuse of the electoral process through vote buying. I do not know enough to tell whether that is a motive or not. Yeah.
Now, Professor Utomi, the economy, let's get to the nitty-gritty of it, is one of the biggest issues in the minds of electorates. They want jobs. They're not happy with the way things are. Nigeria's debt-to-GDP ratio is low compared to countries with similar credit ratings. However, its debt servicing burden is among the highest globally, according to ratings agency Fitch. In 2022, the federal government of Nigeria spent a whopping 96.3% of its revenues paying interest on these loans, the IMF recently said. So, Professor, what needs to be done to address this? And is Nigeria's debt sustainable today?
Well, you see, what we do is to measure the inappropriate thing. A usual international measure is debt to GDP ratio. Where we are as a country that's not producing, that's not exporting, and all of that, taking a debt to GDP ratio will not help you in terms of the problems that you need to deal with, or you will literally become a slave economy. What you need to focus on is your revenues, your income, relative to your capacity to service them, and your production that can lead to expansion, job creation, growth, and new taxes. You can, bellyache all you want about debt to GDP ratio when you really cannot collect taxes. It's not a matter of just that people are not wanting to pay, but your reality shows that those who can, you're already almost overtaxing them, and you need to get the supply side of the economy really simulated and running. It just brings to mind my days as a grad student in the United States when Jimmy Carter was president in the late 70s. And then Reagan won that election of 1980. And a gentleman called Arthur Laffer became fairly famous with supply side economics and his big play on the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve was really a reference to optimal levels of taxation. The truth of the matter is that Nigeria needs to stimulate production. It is probably not the time to increase taxes to those who can produce. And if you do that, you get into a vicious circle that takes you further down the drain. What Nigeria needs to do, not just is to restructure its debt, but begin to invest massively in where production can go up and you can do what China did in a very short period of time. I was already a graduate when Deng Xiaoping became the supreme leader in China after Mao's death. And China was prostrate. But look at what happened in one generation when China made the right kinds of choices. And this is where Nigeria is. Nigeria needs to make those kinds of choices. And because its factor endowment, its latent comparative advantage is such that it can create global value chains from which it can export value-added manufactured goods, Nigeria can quickly recover. But if Nigeria continues to function the way it functions and says all these funny things that I said about debt to GDP ratio, we will just go in a downward spiral. So we need to understand what we're dealing with and indicators that make sense in how we explain the problem and the possible solution.
Now, Professor, petrol subsidies, it's a big elephant in the room, and a lot of people have been arguing for and against it. Petrol subsidies cost the Nigerian government $10 billion in 2022 alone. The presidential candidate of the APC says the subsidy has to go. What is the Labour Party's policy with regards to the petrol subsidy regime?
Subsidies have to go. I mean, what is subsidy? What subsidies are being offered in Nigeria? What is in Nigeria is significantly a criminal enterprise in which subsidies are the excuse from which government officials and a few cronies pocket billions of public money. Now, let me kind of explain this just slightly. Just think about a number of countries. United States at the high end, Pakistan at the perhaps comparable end. How much do they spend in fuel consumption running all over the place per capita? America is a country where people live very long distances. But if you look at what we claim to be our fuel consumption, where we all live next door, compared to Americans who drive 100 miles to work on a daily basis, you will wonder, who is drinking this petrol? It is just a criminal farce. Look, petrol is the ultimate commodity. When you are the ultimate commodity, the margins in that kind of business are thin, extremely thin. Okay? Petrol stations around the world don't make money from selling petrol because that's how thin their margins are. This is why they have to find something else to do with the fact that people need petrol, and therefore there's traffic through their forecourt. That's why Total will give you bonjour. You come in and you buy your
coffee.
Provisions there. Mobile will give you mini mart. That's where they make money, not from selling petrol. But in Nigeria, you hear that the man is in the petrol business. Say, hey, rich man. Rich from doing what? From being a thief. It's all the NMPC people. If I had my way, I will shut down NMPC. I'll put all of them in quarantine for some time before we begin to look at the problems of Nigeria. No, there's no subsidy. Subsidy is a vast 80% of it at least is not subsidy. And competition will bring down the prices. We also what happened with GSM in our country. People need to understand how market economies work. And so, yes, subsidies must go immediately. I don't think we need to build simple elite consensus around things that make sense and things that don't make sense.
Now, Prof, just before we begin to wrap up our conversation, what are the chances of the Labour Party in the general elections? And how do you respond to critics of the Labour Party's chances as saying they're only popular on social media and that they can't pull the necessary votes needed for Mr. Peter Obi to emerge as the next president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria?
Have you heard anything that sounds more nonsensical than that? You really have ever heard anything more nonsensical than that? Look, people say things to give themselves some kind of level of comfort around their problems. Every poll, local and international, has been conducted for the last 6 months has put P2B ahead of Bola Tinubu and Atiku Abubakar. So why does anybody who is rational continue to make statements like, oh, they don't have... It's just that they are looking for rationale and excuses to justify when they rig. No. Labour has by far the higher chance than any of the other parties, as polling show consistently. They say to you, well, they don't have agents in 189. So what they're saying to you is, because they don't have agents, assuming that's correct, we can cheat there. So that's why we win them, because we are more able to cheat. We need the world that people are proud of the fact that they have the greater capacity to cheat. Is that democracy? Well, let me bring you the good news. The good news, and I was today in Abuja at ADC coming together, one of many parties, to declare massively support for Peter Obi and Dati Baba Ahmed. The agents from ADC, Labour Party, and several of the other parties combined far exceed that of both the PDP and the APC. Then you have all these many support groups, including religious organizations and all of them, who are citizen observers. I want to assure you that in every polling station, no matter how remote they are in Nigeria, you would have more than 12 people from Peter Obi campaign organization.
I would like to say a big thank you to you, Professor Utomi, for being a part of PHQ today. We do appreciate your insights and your time. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now it's time for me to give you something to chew on. Stay with me. I will be right back.